When we think of D-Day, we think of the assaults on the Normandy beaches and the airborne landings. But the story of D-Day begins almost 4 years to the day earlier, on another beach 298 kilometres away. A beach whose name will become almost as infamous as the likes of Omaha and Sword, but for a different reason. That beach is Dunkirk. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk took place between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940. Germany's forces had relentlessly pushed back the Allies during the Battle of France, driving it mercilessly to the sea. As the brave French, Belgian and British troops fought a desperate defence around the main town, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops clustered on the beach awaiting rescue. In a turn of events that would come to be known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, every possible seagoing vessel for the United Kingdom, along with naval craft from France and Belgium, set sail to rescue the trapped forces. Following the British Expeditionary Force's defeat and withdrawal from France, the battered yet unbroken Allied nations knew that the day would come when the fight would once again be taken to the German forces in occupied Europe. On the 4th of June 1940, the day Operation Dynamo concluded, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, made it clear that Britain and her allies would not take this defeat lying down.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
In the aftermath of the Battle of Dunkirk, Britain remained steadfast in her resolve to never surrender, but was considerably weakened by the events of the Battle of France and in no position to return in the immediate future. The seemingly unstoppable might of the German military forces had swept across Europe, conquering vast amounts of territory and establishing control through either occupation, annexation, or puppet governments. At the time of the fall of France, much of Europe was already under the rule of Hitler's Nazi Germany, which by the end of September 1940 was strengthened by the Tripartite Pact, formally uniting Japan, Italy and Germany as the Axis powers. The shockwaves of Germany's conquest was felt around the world, the results reaching the United States, which in December of 1940 ruled out any possibility of negotiations and began to promote its Lend-Lease policy to the British, whilst also preparing for a full-scale offensive against Germany. The stage had been set for one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. Within days of the British forces' retreat and withdrawal from France, Italy had invaded, declaring war on both France and Britain. But their aggression wouldn't stop there. Italy's air force, the Regia Aeronautica, would go on to attack and besiege Malta. By the end of the summer, Italy's campaign had seen them conquer British Somaliland and launch attacks into Egypt. The Italian aggression would continue until a failed attack on Greece left the Italian forces suffering heavy casualties. It's at this time Hitler turned his attention to the Balkans, in a move to threaten the Romanian oil fields and challenge British dominance in the Mediterranean. It's in February of 1941, in a response to Allied victories in North Africa, which led to Italian troops being pushed back and dislodged from their foothold in eastern Libya, that the German forces dispatched their own expeditionary force, with the infamous Erwin Rommel in command. By the end of March 1941, Rommel's Afrika Korps were driving back the Commonwealth forces. Concurrently, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, Germany and Italy took control of Yugoslavia and Greece in less than a month. Their campaign in the Balkans coming to an end with the airborne capture of the Greek island of Crete. By July, British-led forces invaded and occupied the French possessions of Syria and Lebanon. But this is as far as British conquest would go, with little gains and being no closer to a major victory over the German war machine. Britain stood firm. Germany by now had stabilised the situation in the Balkans and North Africa enough to turn their attention to the grand prize of their conquest. At around 03:15 hours on the 22nd of June 1941, the Eastern Front erupted in a firestorm, as the largest land invasion in military history commenced. Over 3.8 million personnel of the Axis powers invaded the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile front. At the same time, the Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, issued a declaration of war to the Soviet Union, inadvertently handing Britain a much-needed and very powerful ally.
Сегодня в 4 часа утра, без предъявления каких-либо претензий к Советскому Союзу, без объявления войны, германские войска напали на нашу страну, атаковали наши границы во многих местах.
Soon after the invasion, on the 12th of July 1941, Churchill and Stalin signed the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, a declaration stating that the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union would fight together to defeat Nazi Germany.
Не первый раз нашему народу приходится иметь дело с нападающим, зазнавшимся врагом. В свое время на поход Наполеона в Россию наш народ ответил Отечественной войной, и Наполеон потерпел поражение, пришел к своему краху. То же будет и с зазнавшимся Гитлером, объявившим новый поход против нашей страны.
Early on in the campaign, the German forces, employing their tried and tested blitzkrieg tactics, erupted into the Soviet Union, decimating the underprepared, undertrained and poorly organised Red Army soldiers. It was clear that the purges Stalin had inflicted on its military had a disastrous impact on their capability. The once greatest and most advanced fighting force in the world was brutally shattered by the professionalism and battle experience of the veteran German army. An invasion was becoming more and more urgent. Stalin desperately pushed the Allies to open a second front in Europe as soon as possible to relieve his beleaguered troops. Almost a year later, Stalin's persistence had paid off to an extent. The Soviet Union and the United States together announced that a full understanding was reached with regard to the urgent task of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. However, this was not to be. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stepped in and reasoned with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, explaining that the Allies were undermanned, under-equipped and underprepared for such a vast undertaking. Instead, it was suggested the Allied forces launch operations in the Mediterranean and North Africa, where Britain already had troops stationed. Yet another year would pass on the Eastern Front without an Allied invasion of Europe, until finally, during the Trident Conference in May of 1943, the US and UK firmly decide on a cross-channel assault of France within the next year. At the same time, the Soviet forces were gathering considerable momentum after their great victory at Stalingrad. Yet although the Trident Conference had led to a joint decision to launch an invasion, no planned dates or promises would be made until November of 1943, When the Big Three met at the Tehran Conference and Roosevelt and Churchill promised the opening of the long-awaited Second Front in May of 1944. The time had come for Allied leaders to undertake the planning of the largest seaborne invasion ever. Though it may seem as if a decisive blow had been delivered to the Allies, they were far from throwing in the towel. In a remarkable feat of planning, the combined forces of Europe, America, and further away colonies were preparing the greatest feat of military action ever seen. 3 nations around the world joined together to orchestrate the coming invasion. Britain had become the new front line in a truly global conflict. The leaders of the resistant forces set to work. The first major step, and possibly the most vital, was deciding where to land the invasion force. From as early as 1942, the concept of a seaborne assault on mainland Europe was being considered. However, due to the commitment of Allied troops to Operation Torch in North Africa, and later on the invasion of Sicily, an invasion made before 1944 was not possible, and so planning was slow, disorganised, and very ambiguous. An American artillery officer by the name of Major General Ray Barker had been at the forefront of planning since 1942, after America's move to become directly involved in the war effort following Pearl Harbor. Barker, who by 1943 had reached the rank of Brigadier General, along with a British officer, Major General John Sinclair, offered up the first legitimate plan for invasion under the codename Operation Skyscraper. Operation Skyscraper entailed a vast landing of Allied troops on the French coast, at Caen and the Cotentin Peninsula, and most importantly, it highlighted the probability of facing a fierce opponent and not an enemy on the brink of collapse. However, as much of a giant leap forward in planning as it was, Operation Skyscraper was plagued with problems. The lack of focus during the preceding years from higher Allied leaders had left vital questions unanswered and enormous grey areas concerning vital elements. It cannot be overlooked at this time that Allied command still had not decided on where to land the Allied force. This meant units could not be trained, enemy strength and composition was unclear, and it also meant that there were no clear post-landing objectives. When Operation Skyscraper was presented, the summary perfectly captured the reality of the situation, stating, "For what are we to plan and prepare?" It was concluded at this time that to defer the decision is to decide not to be ready. Fortunately, the plan would not be laid to rest. Around the same time, another British officer, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick "Freddie" Morgan, had returned with his staff from Sicily. Lieutenant General Morgan was precisely who the Allies needed to organise and solidify a plan for the invasion. Morgan had extensive experience in planning amphibious landings. As early as May 1942, he had begun theorising ways to launch assaults across the Rhine River, as no modern plans for large-scale amphibious assaults existed. And Morgan's experience did not end there. Late in 1942, he was assigned the task of planning contingency amphibious assaults in North Africa, which were eventually shelved. This led to another operational plan for an assault on Sardinia, which was also destined to never take place. Regardless of the fact the planning work Morgan and his staff had worked so tirelessly on had never been implemented, it had given Morgan and his staff the vital experience needed for the largest invasion by sea ever conceived. This experience was not lost on the British Chief of Staff, who quickly requested he brief them on the existing plans for a cross-channel invasion. This would lead to Morgan seeking out Brigadier General Barker and Major General Sinclair. The brief Morgan would deliver was so detailed and so impressive that the Chief of Staff would go on to appoint him on the 26th of April 1943 as the leader of a new organisation, tasked with the planning of the eventual invasion of Europe. With a strong belief in the necessity of joint planning between the British and US forces, the newly created team, known as the Chief of Staff Supreme Allied Commander, or Cossack, with Barker as his deputy, began planning in earnest. Cossack was given till July the 15th to develop 3 interrelated plans. A deception plan, codenamed Operation Bodyguard, a concept for a rapid invasion should Germany collapse, codenamed Operation Rankin, and a main invasion against prepared enemy defences, codenamed Operation Overlord. With his team's 90-day deadline in place, Morgan set about deciding the main factor of the plan, the field of battle. The Allied planners identified 4 possible landing locations: Brittany, the Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy, and the Pass de Calais. Very early on, the decision to rule out Brittany and the Cotentin Peninsula was made, as a peninsula, from a strategic standpoint, allowed for the possibility of being cut off and surrounded by German forces. This now left just 2 viable options. Calais certainly offered a tempting opportunity. By distance, it was closer to the English coast. Its proximity was also very close to the port of Antwerp, and also to the border of Germany. And lastly, the surrounding network of road links and the terrain were very favourable. These factors, beneficial to the Allies, were not lost on the Germans either, and to that end, Calais was the most heavily defended part of the Atlantic Wall. With the disaster at Dieppe still looming in the minds of all Allied planners, the risk far outweighed the reward. The choice was now obvious. The stage for one of the most important and complex battles the world had ever seen was set. The Allies would invade Normandy.